My topic for the practical midterm is the back squat. It's the movement that I chose. Movement description for this activity, the back squat. It's a fundamental compound movement, targets multiple muscle groups, requires coordinated motion across several joints. It's all got to fit together for it to be effective and risk-free. The movement begins with the individual standing upright with feet about shoulder width apart, barbell resting, as you can see in this picture, right about on the upper trap, just below the cervical spine. Hands gripping the bar are about shoulder width, slightly more, but it's just same width on both sides. The chest stays elevated and pointed up, not caving in. Neutral spine is important to this movement as well. Core bracing will help with that and keep that lumbar from caving in, putting too much stress on it. As the lifter initiates the descent, the hips will move back and down while the knees flex. That hip movement is crucial. Hinging that hip back will help the knees to not need to go out over in front of the toes. So that hip hinge backward is a very important part of the movement. Knees want to stay over the toes. The torso will lean slightly forward to maintain balance. Movement continues until the thighs reach at least parallel to the floor, like in that image on the slide. Parallel to the floor, deeper if you'd like, but that is the cutoff point. The ascent is just reverse of the motion, driving through the heels and midfoot, extending knees, extending the hips, and returning to that starting standing position. The purpose of the barbell back squat is strengthening lower body, improving functional movement patterns. The squatting pattern is one of the most common in everyday living, so training it functionally is one of the purposes. From a biomechanical perspective, it promotes joint stability, helps with your muscle coordination, and force production through a triple extension at the ankles, knees, and hips, which is essential for athletic performance as well as daily activities. For the anatomical breakdown of the squat movement, you can divide the movement into two primary phases: the eccentric descent and the concentric ascent. During the eccentric phase, the individual will lower into the squat position, stretching out the hamstrings, quads, calves, as the hip flexes and the knee flexes and the ankle dorsiflexes. The concentric phase begins at the bottom and continues all the way up until the body returns to standing as you push up and stand through the squat, requiring muscle shortening to generate that upward force. Throughout the movement, the quadriceps, hamstrings, gluteus maximus, and erector spinae are key contributors to producing the movement. The quadriceps originate at the femur, insert tibial tuberosity, performing knee extension concentrically. The hamstrings originate at the ischial tuberosity, insert at the tibia and fibula, contributing to hip extension and knee flexion. In this case, for the squat, concentrically they contribute to hip extension. Gluteus maximus originates at the ilium and sacrum, inserting into the femur and IT band, driving hip extension as well. The hip is a ball and socket joint, allowing for flexion and extension, while the knee, a hinge joint, supports flexion and extension exclusively. The hip allowing many more movements than that, but in this case, just flexion and extension. The ankle also contributes dorsiflexion and plantar flexion in this case. Muscle contractions vary by the phase. Eccentric contractions dominate the descent, while concentric contractions power the upward phase, with isometric contractions stabilizing the core and spine throughout, holding that neutral spine position. The quadriceps and glutes are the agonists. The hamstrings contribute as synergists for that hip extension, and the erector spinae and core muscles serve as some stabilizers to keep that neutral spine position, as I mentioned. Functional anatomy analysis. Several key concepts apply to the back squat. Length-tension relationship is very important as muscles generate optimal force at mid-range lengths, which aligns with the mid-squat position. The force-length relationship highlights that force production decreases if the muscle is overly stretched or shortened, reinforcing the importance of proper depth and positioning. The force velocity curve is also relevant. During slower controlled squats, muscles produce greater force than during a high-speed squat because the force velocity curve is inverse. Higher the force, lower the velocity, and vice versa. Stretch shortening cycle contributes to explosive power in the ascent when lifters take advantage of the elastic energy that they store from the eccentric phase. They explode into the concentric. They will be using that potential energy, or that elastic energy they built up on the end of that eccentric phase. Active insufficiency can limit force production if the hamstrings are too shortened at the bottom, while passive insufficiency could happen if the hip flexors are overstretched. In terms of range of motion, hips recommended to achieve approximately 100 to 120 degrees of flexion is optimal there. Knees about 120 to 130 degrees of flexion. Ankles around 20 degrees of dorsiflexion is the recommended amount for normal levels. Muscle elasticity, which is the ability to return to resting length, enhances energy storage and recoil. Extensibility, or the capacity to stretch of a muscle, allows full range of motion without restriction. And contractility of the muscle is the ability to generate force during contraction, and it's essential for both control and power production in a movement, which is very essential. All those are very essential in this squat movement and apply very well. From a biomechanical perspective, there are several kinetic principles that influence squat performance. So from the kinetics side first, during the descent and ascent, moment arms exist between the center of mass in each joint. For the squat specifically, that happens at the hips, knees, and ankles. Torque has a very big impact on this movement, with the calculations showing how using force multiplied by the moment arm length show how slight shifts in bar or foot position could dramatically change certain joint loading depending on how you alter the movement. The internal forces are generated by the muscle contractions, and the external forces include the barbell weight and the ground reaction force pushing up through the feet, as well as gravitational force on the body mass as well. A free body diagram of the descending position, or the descending motion of this movement, would look like one force vector pointing straight down, representing the gravitational forces on the barbell and the body mass, while there would be a opposing ground reaction force directed straight upward, produced by the individual and the forces being pressed down into the ground opposing the weight. Now for the descending phase, the gravitational force vectors on the body mass and the barbell would be slightly larger than the ground reaction force, since the individual is descending, meaning that the gravitational forces are slightly overcoming the ground reaction force and the force produced by the individual to oppose the weight. In terms of kinematics, the barbell back squat primarily occurs in the sagittal plane, with flexion and extension happening at the hip, knee, and ankle, occurring around the transverse axis. At the hip, flexion and extension are the primary actions, the knee also performing flexion and extension, and the ankle contributing with dorsiflexion on the descent, plantar flexion during the ascent. And the torso will maintain the same posture ideally with a slight forward lean to balance the external load over the foot, minimizing shear stresses on the lumbar spine as well. For the force application calculations, just did a work calculation first, the second one there, just force times distance. So for example, if someone's squatting 100 kilograms, for the force, multiply mass times acceleration, so mass times the gravitational acceleration, which is 9.81 for the force, and say you squatted, the bar moved a total of 0.6 meters displacement through the air. Multiply that together, you get 589 joules for the work produced. And power calculation, power equals work divided by time. So we have the work calculation already. So power equals 589 joules. Say you did the squat, the concentric movement in 0.7 seconds. So divide 589 joules by that 0.7 seconds, and you'll have 841 watts is the power for this movement. So application discussion for some inefficiencies that could produce injury risk and how to go about fixing those. Some common inefficiencies and injury risks with barbell back squat often stem from poor technique or a mobility limitation or a muscle imbalance that could be producing some ineffective movement that could be producing a risk of injury. Some common examples of these are an excessive forward lean during the squat in the spine, could increase shear stresses on the lumbar spine. Another common one is valgus knees collapsing in during that squat movement. It heightens medial knee stress, which increases ACL injury risk during the squat. Insufficient ankle dorsiflexion can force compensations at the knees and hips. The ankles will want to come off the ground if that is the case, if they can't dorsiflex enough to adequately complete the squat movement. Maintaining a neutral spine with core bracing, ensuring proper knee tracking over the toes, and addressing mobility deficits through targeted interventions are the ways to make sure you're completing the squat correctly. So, an example, exercises to fix a specific deficit in the squat or inefficiency would be if an individual has overly tight pecs, causing them to have rounded shoulders going anteriorly and weak upper back musculature. You could have them inhibit and lengthen their pecs, inhibit it, foam roll it if you can get in a position to do that, or use a lacrosse ball, tennis ball, baseball up against the wall and just roll it over that overactive pec, and then stretch, like in the picture on the slide there, pec stretch to lengthen that pec. And then also targeting the upper back musculature, doing some rows, doing some shrugs, making sure that the traps, rhomboids, rear delts are strong enough to keep the body in that neutral spine position so that in the squat, those rounded shoulders don't produce some thoracic rounding and can be taken care of without a risk of injury. And references.